For today, I want first to introduce you to our speakers. Our first speaker is Berit Johnsen. She's a Norwegian prison researcher and leading the research department of KUS, linked with the University College of the Norwegian Correctional Service. And in the very near future, she will be one of the board members of RESCALED. On the other hand, we have Sebastian Scheerer. He is Professor Emeritus of the Criminology from the University of Hamburg, and he calls himself an abolitionist. She is from Norway and he's from Germany. Both are critical supporters of RESCALED, but from a very different angle. So Berit, you know RESCALED and you know our mission. But is our mission to replace all large prison institutions with detention houses too radical or not radical enough? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Aurelia. Radical within the field of politics means large changes within a short period of time. What is to be punished and how to punish in a society are political questions, so to use the concept radical in this way at this seminar, I think is legitimate. According to this definition, if the alteration from prison to detention houses implies large changes that one seeks to implement quite quickly, then the mission is radical. If the alteration is small, however, then it's not radical. This means that radical depends on what you have and what you want to achieve. If we take Norway as an example, which has a long history of small-scale detention, we might think that implementing detention houses is not radical, but is it necessarily so? With a complex geography and with fjords and mountains and a small population scattered throughout the whole country, each community or county have a long history of taking care of their own offenders. Built in the 1850s and 60s, many prisons started out as arrest houses, and later on they functioned as assistant prisons. However, until many of them were closed down in the 1970s and 80s. Some of these prisons, however, still exist today, such as Larvik Prison, which is a high-security prison housing 16 young offenders under the age of 25. One reason for these small prisons' existence is the principle of proximity, that an offender should serve his or her sentence as close to home as possible. This makes it easy for the prisoners to stay in contact with family and friends, for example, by receiving visits. This should make the resettlement process easier, which is in line with the mission of the detention houses. One may ask, what is the difference between Larvik Prison and a detention house? It is not the size, 16 is small. Is it the effect of reintegration? I don't think so, and I have to add that Larvik Prison has been initiating and been central in developing a model for the rehabilitation of young men serving sentences for sexual offences. Is it a label then? Is Larvik Prison a detention house, or does it have to change name to Larvik Detention House to become one? Larvik Prison is actually not a prison anymore. After a fusion of two prisons, it is now a department of a large prison housing altogether 66 prisoners. Is Larvik still a small prison, or is it a small prison department? There are several such small prison departments in Norway. Could they be labeled as detention houses? Could detention houses be part of larger prison complexes, or perhaps rather detention complexes? My impression is that prison or detention complexes are now being established in several European countries. The vision of the detention houses is a humane detention where people are treated decently and individually, and where the focus is on interaction with the community and reintegration. We know that this is more likely to occur in small prisons or detention houses, but is small a guarantee to accomplish this vision? To organize prison in prison complexes is lucrative for an employer because then employees can be moved around and work in different establishments wherever they are needed. To accomplish the vision, you most likely need a stable working force. You need staff that have time to get to know the prisoners and are interested in learning to know them. At the same time, staff invites the prisoners to get to know them too, at least in some degree. In this way, prisoners and staff can build trust in each other, which is crucial for a humane detention and a successful integration. How radical the mission of replacing prisons with detention houses is depends on when the mission is accomplished. Is it accomplished when one of several prisons, for example, in a prison complex, are small? Is it when all prisons are replaced with detention houses and have become members of the detention houses family? Or is it possible that the mission is not radical enough?
If we want to transform a system, it's much more important that we do it right than we want to do it like very fast and with not learning on the way. But now I want to make the bridge to Sebastian. I have the same question for you. Is our mission radical or not radical enough?
And your research, Berit, shows that Norway is more aware of the advantages of small prisons than my country. Germany's prisons are relatively big, holding on average 500 inmates, and to replace my own city's Santa Fu prison, inaugurated in 1879 by dozens of small detention houses, has never crossed anyone's mind here in Germany. As far as the population is concerned, few people like to live close to a large prison in their neighborhood, and even fewer, I'm afraid, would like to live close to anti-prisons where the inmates are not safely locked away, but trying to interact and communicate with their neighbors. So the NIMBY effect is probably very strong in Germany. And I still remember the look in the face of the Hamburg justice ministers when I mentioned Hans Klaus and his idea of the Häusen once. He must have thought that this poor professor has gone nuts completely. If we suppose that one day RESCALED should send missionaries to Germany, they will, of course, meet some fervent opposition from conservative people and population and media. But it is even worse, I'm afraid, because they will also meet opposition from progressives, at least from a loud minority of progressives who, as we know, can be quite a nuisance when it comes to reforms. These progressive people who might oppose RESCALED, they might rest their argument on three thoughts. The first one that I hear quite a few times is that a small detention house is still a place of involuntary confinement, and places of involuntary confinement are prisons. And so the argument is a prison is a prison is a prison and remains a prison, even if it's made nice and cozy and modern. The second argument is from penal abolitionists, who should be distinguished from prison abolitionists, because they say we have to leave the orbit of crime and punishment. We have to invent non-punitive and reconciling sanctions. And anything that stays in the orbit of crime and punishment is something to be opposed and abolished. So for prison abolitionists of the kinds I was describing, and for penal abolitionists, these reforms might just not be radical enough. So the large part of the population and the political system would say it's far too radical, but some of my best friends might say these reforms are simply not radical enough, and we don't want to have anything to do with them. And critical criminologists might join this chorus because they have had a number of historical experiences where seemingly revolutionary reforms like restorative justice, juvenile diversion, and older initiatives at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, they were all trying to overcome the traditional penal system and prison system and didn't make it and ended up as a kind of nice little ornaments. So critical criminologists might fear that RESCALED will not be able to rescale the system, but it will itself be rescaled in the sense of being dwarfed into just another brick in the wall. The prison system itself will survive because of its inertia and its strength and popular support. So these three arguments, all three could be seen or could be summarized in the way of saying RESCALED and Detention is simply not radical enough. I don't actually believe in the first argument. I don't believe that a prison is a prison is a prison. That sounds like formal logic, but it is not. Because when you look at it closer, what these people mean actually is that the prison systems are degrading and inhumane and brutal, and this is why they are morally outrageous and they have to be abolished. Now, to just say formally, Detention or RESCALED, small detention houses, they are also houses of involuntary confinement, therefore they are prisons, therefore they are morally outrageous, because therefore they are also brutal and repressive and inhumane. That is simply denying reality. You just have to look at the reality itself, and you will find that this kind of argument, convincing as it seems at first sight, a prison is a prison is a prison, is crap. It's just nonsense, because it doesn't leave any room for different realities, and we only have to look around us to see that realities are different. Not every place of confinement is like the new Bilibid prison in the Philippines. In that prison, you have some maybe 20,000 prisoners, and 20% of them die every year because of murder, torture, infectious diseases. 20%. That is what the director of the health service of that prison system told the Philippines Senate just 1.5 years ago. Now, and of course you have innumerable, countless examples all over the world where really the prison system needs to be abolished today on moral grounds, even if we know that it cannot be abolished today or not even tomorrow. But morally, it's so outrageous that you cannot sustain it for one more day on moral grounds. And we all know that there are prisons like Halden Prison or Bastoy Island in the Oslo Fjord, and there are many others all over the world, in which prisoners are being treated like human beings, decently and with a lot of support. And you simply cannot say that all prisons are inhumane and barbaric. So this first argument, seemingly convincing, a prison is a prison is a prison, for me is just, these people just don't know what inhumane means, and or they are blind to reality. The second argument, the penal abolitionist argument, is much more solid in the sense that there are good reasons to say sociologically that societies are evolving, and sometimes societies, they carry with them anachronistic means of social control that are simply not adequate anymore, even if they have been adequate to earlier stages of social development. And quite a few people, including myself, argue that today's society of control is a society that differs from Foucault's society of discipline in that it simply does not need milieu d'enfermement, the environments of enclosure or confinement. We just simply do not need large compounds of the Eastern State Penitentiary or of the Pentonville type, all conceived at the end of the 18th and built in the early 19th century, that are means of social control that are simply not adequate anymore. And you can extend that argument, and you can say that not even the notions of crime and punishment, which are age-old, are actually adequate to the knowledge that we have today of the human being, of social norms and their transgression. So the penal abolitionists, they have a point when they say, let's get over the universe of crime and punishment and let us go forward to really non-punitive sanctions that do not want to inflict intentional suffering on people. I think there are people like the Quakers and a lot of progressive religious groups or socialist groups, anarchist groups, etc., that would argue along those lines. The big question for these people to whom I belong is how do we meet detention houses that are still based on crime and punishment and the courts, etc., but that do want to treat people like people. And I think another Norwegian thinker, Thomas Mathisen, can help us a lot in that respect. In his Politics of Abolition, he was distinguishing between reforms that are bad, which he called positive reforms, because they add something positive to the existing system. They add a nice little touch, or they add a nice little something to the legitimacy or to the expansion of the stability or the modernity of the system. And he distinguished these bad reforms that penal abolitionists should oppose to good reforms, which he called negative, because they would take away elements of repression from the system. Actually, coming to think of it, in the Weimar Republic, we had a legal philosopher as a minister of justice for a short time, for 2 short times. And he actually had said that the system is so rotten that for the time being, the most important thing to be done in criminal policy would be negative criminal policy. Take away bad, repressive, inhumane parts of our ways of dealing with criminals. And that is very close, or let's say what Thomas Mathisen said was very close to this Gustav Radbruch kind of thinking of the Weimar Republic. To make a long story short, a negative reform is a reform that takes away parts of the repressive system, and in that sense subtracts repression, makes for less repression in the system. And as far as I can see, RESCALED and Johnsen is the perfect example for a negative reform in that sense. Negative in the sense of we're on a good way to have less and less repression, unnecessary, historically unnecessary and morally untenable repression if we support RESCALED. So I think that's the solution to penal abolitionists. It's by far not radical enough what RESCALED wants, and it is by far not radical enough what it will accomplish, but it is a big step in the right direction of getting rid of inhumane conditions in prisons and towards a more civilized way of dealing with problems, transgressive behavior, hurting behavior, crimes, deviance, however you want to call it.
The Norwegian situation is quite different. As you told us, you already have a large history of small-scale detention. Does this fact make it easier to implement our mission in Norway, or are there challenges or opportunities that you see when we would try to pursue our mission in Norway?
And as I said earlier, Norway has a long history of small-scale detention, but even so, and in spite of the principle of proximity, the tendency in Norway is to close down the small and ancient prison and build large and new ones. Materially, the old small prisons are out of date, and these facilities do not meet standards such as each cell having a toilet and a bathroom, ventilation, physical working environment requirements for staff, and so on. And in Norway, prisons are never overcrowded. In lack of prison capacity, sentenced persons are placed in a queue, and in certain periods, several hundreds and even several thousands people have been waiting to serve their sentences in this queue. Because of the prison queue situation and the political focus on reducing this queue, Norway has been in a situation where new prison capacity has been needed rapidly. To minimize the time to plan and build new prisons, and that is called for tenders and so on, a standardized model for prison buildings has been developed, which is called Modell 2015 or Modell 2015. To quote Yvonne Jervis, this model represents a rapid-built prison, and the model is a traditional four-star building where form follows function. Each model can take 96 prisoners, and the 4 models that have been built so far are part of larger prison complexes. In this situation, it is challenging to promote the building of small prisons, or to preserve the old and small one as well. And some have tried, believe me, but the neglect of taking care of the old and small prisons for decades have made them so worn out that the reparation and maintenance is very costly. Besides, I experience the processes of closing down and building new prisons as quite intern. This is something that is discussed between the Ministry of Justice, the Directorate in the Correctional Service, and Statsbygg, a public construction company that builds and owns the prisons. Sometimes, often when a decision of closing a prison is taken, local politicians try to change the decision, and ideas like, why cannot this prison house women prisoners, may be launched, as if they, women prisoners, do not need to be accommodated in buildings that keep a certain standard. This brings me over to the next challenge, the so-called NIMBY that also Sebastian mentioned, or not in my backyard effect. For a neighborhood, it might be easier to accept a detention house than a prison, especially a large prison. Prisons are stigmatized facilities. Neighborhoods often share this stigma, and prisoners are often presented and understood as dangerous persons that many people do not want to be involved with. To change the label from prisons to detention houses and make the houses blended with its neighborhood surroundings may make them more acceptable. Likewise, to refer to persons serving the sentence simply as persons rather than prisoners may make it easier to accept them. Words have a kind of meaning here. In communities where prisons are well integrated, citizens of these communities do not want them to close down. This is not only because people will lose their jobs, but also because there is a positive interaction between the people inside the prison and the people outside. In Vik prison, for example, a quite small prison on the western coast of Norway, prisoners help people in the community with clearing their yards for snow in the wintertime and with the gardening in the summertime. This means that it is a great value of preserving old and well-integrated prison or detention houses, if you like, or establish new prisons or detention houses in neighborhoods or communities where the prison has become a natural part of the function of the society. However, prison populations change, and right now in Norway, about 30% of incarcerated persons are sentenced for sexual offenses. The prison population is also older than earlier, and their mental health is in general quite bad. Persons sentenced for sexual offenses, especially if the victims are children, are today's monsters. A few of them actually serve the sentences in detention houses, but it has been very problematic to establish these houses because of the NIMBY effect. I'm quite convinced that it is easier to establish detention houses that are quite open, and in my opinion, some of the halfway houses in Norway that exist today are detention houses. They are small, they are well integrated in the area where they are located, and the focus is on resettlement. My guess is that it is far more difficult to establish detention houses where the level and focus on safety and security is higher. Some very serious incidents of violence have unfortunately happened in smaller prisons, including the killing of a prison officer. These incidents have happened in larger prisons as well, but when they happen in small prisons, the size is considered as a factor that has increased the risk for these incidents to happen. The amount of staff is important for the state of preparedness in the facility, and small facilities need less staff than larger facilities. Even if one might argue that small facilities make incarcerated persons to behave better, I believe it is difficult to achieve full support for this argument. In Norway, I think the greatest opportunity to establish detention houses is for women prisoners serving the sentences in men's prison. These women stay in small units inside a large prison, and I don't know of anyone that is happy with this arrangement, at least the governors of these prisons. It is difficult to adjust imprisonments to the needs of the women there, and they often have fewer opportunities for work, leisure activities, and other activities than the men have. Here, a detention house can meet a need that is easy to realize and accept, and I don't think it will be difficult to gain political or bureaucratic support within the Ministry of Justice and the Correctional Service for this idea, and this may be a start of establishing detention houses or expand the idea of small prisons in Norway. And if the detention houses work according to the vision, which is humane detention where people are treated decently and individually, and where the focus is on interaction with the community and reintegration, the chances of replacing more of the large prisons with detention houses is greater. However, I think small-scale imprisonment needs documentation and research in order to convince politicians and bureaucrats that detention houses work. To claim that small is good is not enough. We need proof. Thank you.
I would like to ask a question about that, because I think it's a bit funny that you are asking for more proof while we at RESCALED, when we try to convince people of the benefits of small scale. We actually use your research to make that point, because you found, when looking only at closed prisons in Norway, I think, you found that the prisons with a capacity of less than 50 prisoners had a higher quality of life than the prisons with more than 50 places. So don't you think that's convincing enough?
No, at least in Norway, we try to refer to this research when they started to use this model 2015, and they didn't see the point with it. So I think we need more. The research that you refer to the data was collected in 2006 and 2007, I think. So it starts to get a little bit old. We should have new data on this. And also this was when we carried out this study, which is a study, or the concept of the design is from the University of Cambridge, Alison Liebling and her colleagues at the Prison Research Center there. And it's the measuring of the quality of life. And we carried it out like a very quantitative study. And what we were able to do was to establish a truth that it was statistically significant that the smaller prisons is better than, or the quality of life in small prisons is better than in the larger ones. But we don't, such research doesn't tell us why. Why is these prisons better? And from the questionnaire that we used, it is a lot of question about the relationship between staff and prisoners, and that is an important issue. But I think that it is more into this than just these relationships. So we need research that can be qualitative research that can say us something. Why are these small prisons better than the larger ones?
In the Belgian strategy, we start with transition houses, and we start with focus on young people. So the groups that are more acceptable, or at least what we think will be more acceptable for public opinion, and start there and make people used to detention houses, and then gradually expand the idea. I think, Tim, I'm sorry, I think this is your question. So Sebastian and Berit, what do you think?
Basically, of course, for practical criminal policy, that's the way to go. Pilot projects, trying to show what works and trying to investigate why it works, find out what doesn't work. So there's not much one could say against that. I would happy to see something like that in Germany, probably. My point is not against all these practical steps and gradual steps. What I try to argue is that if academic intellectuals, or however you want to call them, theorists or whatever, if they become, or if abolitionists become theoretical gradualists, and if they propose themselves gradual steps, then in a way they legitimate the persistence of the system that they want to be abolished for the time being. And when you think of slavery or torture or capital punishment, and you're an abolitionist in these respects, then to say, well, let's try to phase out torture, but do it slowly, and try not to torture just in Switzerland, and then we will see if it also works in Austria. That is a kind of paradox. So when you deal with moral arguments, and my argument against the crime and punishment universe is essentially a moral one. on moral grounds, you cannot simply be a gradualist. You cannot say, well, slowly we should abolish the capital punishment. In reality, of course, things never go as fast as they had to go. But if you bow down to reality in anticipation as a theorist, then you legitimate the perpetuity of what you want to abolish. And in theory, that is something that should never be done, as the great slavery abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison said, gradualism in theory is perpetuity in practice. In theory, when you say I'm against capital punishment, you have to be a theoretical radical or a theoretical immediatist. When you say I'm against capital punishment, you're not saying I want it to be abolished 100 years from now. But in theory, you have to say you have no moral right to kill other people. So it is immediately to be abolished, even if your own influence is not strong enough to make that happen immediately. But so it's important to distinguish between theoretical radicalism, which is not a cheap thing. It's a difficult thing, and it's even more difficult if you want to be convincing. And it's very necessary, because if you don't have these theorists, then you will never have the abolition of what you want to be abolished. I could give you a number of examples of anti-slavery movements, but that's certainly not desired here. But this is my point. In practical criminal policy, all this has to be done. But it is also important not only to have pilot projects, research, etc., but also a radical theory.
So what you're saying is actually that we need both of you, so that you can be the theorist and that Berit can tell us how to improve in practice.
Yeah, I think theory and practice, they need each other if we want to make progress, and especially if we don't want big reform projects to be swallowed by the system, which happens all too often.
I see that Tim also asked if this could be a solution for the NIMBY effect. So this start with specific groups that are more, or that we think can be more acceptable for public opinion.
Yes, I think so. If you want to, or if I should reply to Sebastian, if you can't beat them, join them. That is also a strategy, more like a kind of pragmatic one. But we definitely need critical voices as well as the practical work in a way. But I think that if you should start to establish detention houses, it's easier to start with a population that is more easily acceptable in an area. And right now in Oslo we have a discussion that is actually one of the public discussion of the localization of a new prison in Oslo, and they are going to localize a big prison, 250 prisoners, and use this model to 2015, I think. And that is big. No one wants this prison in the neighborhood. It's an NIMBY effect, even if it's going to be one of the most or hot sites in a way. It's where the women prison league are at Bredtvet. But even so, and I do understand it's a forest there. They will get rid of the forest and so on. So it makes huge impact on the society there. So establish smaller prisons, especially in a city or city center, which is also part of the Hoysens or the vision to establish them in city centers where it is easy to get to them, because many of prisons in Norway, they are in the outskirts of of larger cities, and it's difficult to come there. So if your son is there and you want to visit him, you need a car. You cannot go there by public transport. So it's a good idea to establish prison in city centers. But I think that to start with the population that is more easily acceptable, and also to build smaller ones would overcome at least some of the NIMBY effect.
There is a question in the chat that I will translate to English. So it's from a person who works several years in the prison system in Belgium. And he says that a lot of people who work in the system do recognize that the current system does not work, or does not work how it should work. But he also sees that a lot of people who on the outside in society, who are not currently active in the prison system, are really focused on punishment and very punitive. So there is also a lot of work that needs to be done to inform these people. And is that not quite a big job? And is it to overcome? And how should we do that? I think that's the question that has been asked there.
Prisons in city centers or detention houses, and make people interact with the prisoners, like having restaurants, bike reparations, workshops, and so on, will also make people see that these people are not dangerous, that they actually add value to a community. So that's also a start to try to have an impact on the public opinion, which is, as you say, quite negative, and a punitive attitude in societies, I think, is very it's common in several countries, I think. That's a start.
Yeah, I would add maybe like when you think of slavery, it was very important not only to show people that Black people are also people, which has been done and which had a very good influence on public opinion, but also to show the bad sides of the system that you want to abolish. Like in slavery, you had the novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1850, 1851, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that showed the horrors of the slave legislation and the real treatment of fugitive slaves in the United States. And that was such an impact on public opinion that people said, oh, we don't know that, and how terrible. And maybe we really have to get rid of slavery. So we also have to be open to show the horrific sides of the prison system. And I don't think we have to be limited to our national scenery. The prison system is a global system.
I want to thank everyone for joining this first discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I want to thank our speakers again for their much appreciated input. So thank you very much, and hopefully we see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
That was very nice.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.